Soldier disappeared in 1979. 46 years later, medal found in trench sparks revelation. The mud was a thief. It stole the warmth from Dr. Eris Thorne's fingers, the feeling from his knees, and the light from the sky, pulling everything into its cold, greedy embrace. For 3 weeks, this forgotten trench on the German-Czech border had given him nothing but rusted barbed wire, shattered Saracen tins, and the spectral quiet of a forest that had long since reclaimed its dead. The land was part of a recently declassified zone, a wound in the earth sealed by treaties and decades of deliberate forgetting. The official maps called it Sector 81 Delta, a place where, according to records, nothing of consequence had happened since the last NATO exercises in 1975. The mud, however, whispered a different story. It held its secrets with a chilling tenacity, scraped away another layer of damp cloying earth, the trowel making a soft, sucking sound. His breath plumed in the frigid morning air, a ghost of his own making. He was alone, just as he preferred. The grant that funded this dig was small, a pittance from a university history department that had long since turned its gaze to more fashionable conflicts. But for Aris, the Cold War was a landscape of silent ghosts, and this trench was a mass grave of unspoken truths. He felt a familiar thud, the dull clink of metal on bone. He paused, his heart giving a slow, heavy beat. He'd found remains before, mostly animal, a few scattered fragments of soldiers from older, more storied wars. But this felt different. The placement was wrong, too shallow, too hurried. He switched from the trowel to a brush, his movements becoming reverent, surgical. The bristles whispered across the earth, clearing away the dark soil like a shroud. First, the curve of a ribcage, stark white against the black loam. Then, the long, elegant line of a femur. His breath caught. This wasn't a scattered collection of fragments, it was a full skeleton, articulated, lying in a fetal position, as if trying to shield itself from the very earth that had consumed it. The body had been dumped, not buried. There was no uniform, no tattered fatigues, just the naked, lonely white of bone. An execution, then. A quiet disposal. This place was a secret for a reason. He worked for an hour, the world shrinking to the confines of this shallow grave. The silence of the forest deepened, broken only by the drip of moisture from the dense canopy of pines and the frantic thumping of his own heart. As he cleared the soil from around the skeleton's chest, his brush hit something hard, flat, and unyielding, not bone, not stone. He leaned closer, his nose inches from the damp earth, the smell of decay and wet minerals filling his senses. He gently worked the brush around the object, his touch as delicate as a lover's. A metallic glint winked at him, a sliver of purple and bronze that seemed to defy the suffocating darkness of the soil. Slowly, carefully, he lifted it. It was heavy, its weight a shock in his numb fingers. A military medal, its iconic hexagonal shape and the bas-relief of George Washington's profile were unmistakable. A purple heart, the ribbon, astonishingly, was partially intact. Its royal purple and white edges preserved by some chemical miracle of the acidic soil. For a moment, Aris could only stare, his mind refusing to process the anachronism. A purple heart, here, in a trench supposedly abandoned for years before the date that was now becoming visible. As he wiped away the last of the grime, he turned it over. The engraving on the back was crisp, almost pristine. For military merit, PVT Daniel Sutton, 1979. The date hit him like a physical blow. 1979. It was impossible. Every declassified document, every official record, every painstakingly cross-referenced piece of data he had spent a year collating stated, unequivocally, that all US and NATO forces had vacated this sector by the winter of 1975. This area was meant to be a sterile buffer zone, a no-man's land where the two great ideological behemoths of the 20th century had agreed to turn their backs. For a US soldier to be here in 1979 was not just an anomaly, it was a heresy. It was a lie carved in bronze and buried in the mud. He looked from the medal to the skeleton, and a cold wave of dread washed over him, colder than the mud that clung to his clothes. This wasn't a forgotten soldier. This was an erased one, PVT. Daniel Sutton hadn't fallen in a battle that was never recorded. He had been brought here, to this place where no one was supposed to be, and he had been put in the ground. The position of the skeleton suddenly screamed at him, not fetal, but braced. The arms were not shielding the chest, they were pulled up in a defensive posture. The slight, almost imperceptible fractures on the ulnar bones were textbook parry. Fractures, he had tried to block the blows. Arisa's mind raced. Who was Daniel Sutton? What was he doing here in 1979? And who had killed him with such brutal finality that they left him naked in the earth, but had somehow, in their haste or their arrogance, missed the medal that now lay in Arisa's palm, a silent accusation. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. A soldier decorated for military merit, for a wound received in the line of duty, left to rot in an unmarked, unacknowledged grave. His very existence denied by the history. He had ostensibly died serving. His hands shaking, Eris pulled out his satellite phone. His fingers were clumsy, caked with mud, as he keyed in the number for the US Embassy in Berlin. He knew this was a long shot, a bureaucratic labyrinth he was ill-equipped to navigate, but the weight of the medal in his hand demanded it. After a series of transfers that left him feeling like a speck of dust in a vast, indifferent machine, a voice finally came on the line. Slick with the bored professionalism of a career diplomat. Peterson, Political Attache's office. How can I help you? Aris took a breath, trying to keep his own voice steady. My name is Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm an archaeologist conducting a university-sanctioned dig in Sector 81 Delta on the German-Czech border. I've found something. Human remains. There was a pause. Aris could hear the faint clacking of a keyboard. Sector 81 Delta. According to our records, that's a declassified zone. There's nothing there. The tone was dismissive, as if Aris were a crank reporting a UFO sighting. I understand that's the official record, Aris pressed, his voice rising with an urgency he couldn't control. But I'm looking at a full human skeleton. And I found a medal, a US Purple Heart. Another pause, longer this time. The clacking stopped. A what? A Purple Heart, Aris repeated, his grip tightening on the cool metal. It's engraved. The name is Private Daniel Sutton. The year is 1979. The silence on the other end of the line was no longer bored. It was sharp, hostile. That's not possible, Dr. Thorne. You must be mistaken. There were no US personnel operating in that sector in 1979, period. I'm not mistaken, Aris said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm holding it in my hand. He could feel the injustice coiling in his gut, a venomous snake. They weren't just denying it. They were accusing him of being a liar or a fool. Listen to me very carefully. Dr. Peterson's voice was now stripped of all diplomatic pleasantry. It was flat, cold, and absolute. A voice that gave orders and expected them to be obeyed. You have found nothing. You will cease your excavation immediately. You will rebury whatever artifact you believe you've discovered. You will file a final report stating that the site yielded nothing of historical significance. Your grant is hereby terminated, effective immediately, on the grounds of operating outside your sanctioned parameters. Do you understand me? The threat was not veiled. It was a guillotine, held glittering and sharp over his career. Everything he had worked for, the years of study, the lonely digs, the quiet dedication, it could all be severed in an instant. All he had to do was obey. All he had to do was put the lie back in the ground. This is a US soldier, Aris said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. He has a name. He deserves more than to be forgotten. What he deserves, Dr. Thorne, is for you to follow a direct instruction from a representative of the United States government. Peterson retorted, his voice like ice. Consider this a matter of national security. You are in a sensitive area. You have stumbled onto something you are not cleared to understand. For your own good, you will pack your gear, you will leave, and you will forget this conversation ever happened. Rebury him, doctor. Let the dead rest. The line went dead. Aris stood there in the trench, the phone clutched in his hand, the silence of the forest rushing back in to fill the void. Let the dead rest. The phrase was an obscenity. Daniel Sutton had not been resting. He had been hidden. He had been silenced. And the very institution he had served was now actively conspiring to keep him that way. It was a second murder, a murder of memory, of truth. He looked down at the skeleton, its hollow eye sockets staring up at the grey, indifferent sky. The power imbalance was staggering. He was one man, with a trowel and a brush, against the monolithic weight of a government and its secrets. He felt a profound, soul-crushing despair. The kind that comes from witnessing an injustice so vast and so untouchable that to even acknowledge it feels like madness. He was supposed to be a guardian of the past, a seeker of truth. And he was being ordered to become a gravedigger for a lie. His gaze drifted from the skull's empty eyes down to its jaw. Something was there, wedged between the teeth of the mandible. Something he hadn't noticed before. A tiny, unnatural glint. He leaned closer, his heart pounding, a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. Using the delicate tip of his trowel, he gently pried the jaw open. It moved with a dry, cracking sound that seemed to echo the breaking of some sacred vow. There, lodged firmly in a molar, was a gold cap. A single, gleaming gold tooth. It was a detail, a small, intimate, human detail. A man with a gold tooth. A man named Daniel Sutton. A man who had been beaten to death and dumped in a hole in a place he was never supposed to be. In that moment, the skeleton ceased to be a collection of bones, a mere artifact. He was a person. And Peterson's cold, authoritative voice echoed in his mind. Rebury him. Aris looked from the gleaming gold tooth to the purple heart in his palm. The weight of it felt immense, a sacred trust. He could not put it back. He could not be the one to shovel the dirt back over this man's story. To do so would be to become complicit in the crime, to let the silence win. He looked up at the tall dark pines that stood like silent sentinels, guardians of this forgotten place. They had seen what happened here. The mud knew now, so did he. His career was over. He knew that with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. But some things were more important. The truth was more important. Daniel Sutton was more important. A decision, hard and clear, crystallized in his mind. He would not run, he would not obey. He would become the ghost's advocate. He pulled out his personal smartphone, his hands steady now, infused with a defiant purpose. He knelt in the mud, next to the man who had been lost for 46 years, and began to document everything. He took hundreds of high-resolution photos of the grave. The skeleton from every conceivable angle, the parry fractures on the arm bones, the subtle, telltale crack in the back of the skull that he now saw with horrifying clarity. He took a detailed video, narrating his findings in a low, precise voice. The voice of a scientist bearing witness. Finally, he placed the purple heart back on the skeleton's chest, where it belonged. He held the phone over it, the medal and the name and the impossible date filling the frame. He turned on the flash. The sudden, brilliant burst of light was like a lightning strike in the gloom of the trench. A stark, momentary explosion of truth. In a place that had been shrouded in darkness for nearly half a century, it was an act of war, an act of defiance against the shadows. He had been given an order to bury a secret. Instead, he had just declared that he was going to dig it up, no matter what the cost. The flash faded, and he was left once more in the cold, quiet darkness, but something had changed. He was no longer just an archaeologist, he was a witness, and the dead had found their voice. The gold tooth gleamed in the dim light, a tiny, defiant star in the darkness of the skull. It was a promise, a beginning. The first clue in a story that someone, somewhere, had gone to murderous lengths to ensure was never, ever told. Aris Thorne, mud-spattered and career-ruined, had just made it his mission to tell it. The emotional shock of the discovery had now hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He would find out who Daniel Sutton was, and he would find out who had sent him to this cold, lonely patch of earth to die. The cliffhanger wasn't just about a choice, it was about a covenant made between a living man and a dead one, a promise to reclaim a history that had been stolen and buried. The real excavation, the one that would unearth monsters, had only just begun. The year 1979 bled into the lives of three people like a spreading stain. A shared trauma they would never acknowledge, but could never escape. They were a triangle of secrets, their fates bound together in the cold, damp forests of a forgotten borderland. There was the victim, the antagonist, and the witness, each carrying a piece of the story, each broken in their own unique way. The victim was Private Daniel Sutton, and he was not a soldier by nature. He was a poet by soul, a boy from the dust-choked plains of West Texas who had enlisted, not out of patriotism, but out of desperation. His past was a tapestry of quiet failures. His father, a stern, unyielding man who smelled of oil and disappointment, saw Daniel's love for books and words as a weakness, a feminine flaw in the masculine lineage of roughnecks and ranchers. "There's no money in poems, boy," he'd say, his voice a low growl, his calloused hands clenched into fists as if to physically squeeze the softness out of his son. Daniel's youth was a series of small humiliations, fumbling a football, being picked last for everything, finding solace not in the roaring Friday night lights that were the religion of his town, but in the hushed, dusty aisles of the local library. He was a gentle soul in a world that valued only brute strength. His one act of rebellion had been to fall in love with a girl named Clara, a girl with eyes the color of a summer sky and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. But Clara's father was the town banker, and Daniel was just the son of a failed wildcatter. The social chasm was too wide. Her father had made it clear, in a humiliating conversation on the porch of their sprawling ranch house, that Daniel was not good enough, would never be good enough. The army, then, was an escape, a way to prove his father wrong, a way to maybe, just maybe, become the kind of man Clara's father would respect. He had dreams of the GI Bill, of a college education, of a life far away from the Texas dust and the suffocating weight of his father's disapproval. He was sent to West Germany, to a bustling base near the Fulda Gap, a place humming with the tense energy of the Cold War. But even there, his gentle nature made him a target. He didn't drink, he didn't brawl. He spent his off-duty hours writing long, lyrical letters to Clara. Letters filled with a homesickness so profound it was a physical ache. He described the impossibly green hills, the strange, guttural language, the constant, low-grade fear that permeated everything. He was a sheep in a flock of wolves, and the wolves could smell his fear, his wound. The one that earned him the Purple Heart was not a glorious battle injury. It was the result of a stupid, senseless accident. During a live-fire exercise, a piece of faulty equipment had malfunctioned, sending a shard of hot metal tearing into his leg. The pain was immense, but the humiliation was worse. It was another failure, another mark of his inadequacy. He was laid up in the infirmary for weeks, the medal, a bitter irony, pinned to his pillow. It was a decoration for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, a testament to his own bad luck. It was in that infirmary, stewing in his own quiet misery, that he first crossed paths with Sergeant Thomas Corbin. The antagonist, Sergeant Thomas Corbin, was everything Daniel was not. He was carved from granite, a man whose heart seemed to be a cold, hard stone. His past was not one of quiet failure, but of loud, violent success. He was a product of South Boston, of back alleys and broken knuckles, a world where respect was taken, not earned. His father was a Union man with a heavy fist and a thirst for whiskey. And Corbin had learned early that the only way to survive was to be the one throwing the punches. He was a predator, with a predator's instincts for weakness. He'd found his calling in the army, the rigid hierarchy, the clear lines of authority, the sanctioned violence. It suited him. It gave his inherent cruelty a framework, a purpose. He moved through the ranks with a ruthless efficiency, his men following him not out of loyalty, but out of fear. He had a reputation for being a fixer, a man who could make problems disappear. If a soldier had a gambling debt, if a local girl made an inconvenient accusation, if a piece of sensitive equipment went missing, Corbin was the one who handled it, quietly, efficiently, and often, brutally. He operated in the gray areas, the shadows where the official rulebook didn't apply. He was a useful tool for his commanding officers, a blunt instrument they could deploy and then deny. His secret was a deep-seated pathological need for control. He craved the feeling of power over others, the way a junkie craves a fix. He saw the world as a simple binary, the strong and the weak, the predators and the prey. And he had no doubt which one he was. His brokenness was not a wound, it was a void, a gaping emptiness where empathy should have been. He filled that void with the fear he inspired in others. When he saw Private Daniel Sutton, with his poet's eyes and his gentle hands, he didn't just see a weak soldier. He saw a meal. He saw an opportunity to exercise his power in its purest, most undiluted form. Corbin was in charge of special logistics, a euphemism for the network of unofficial supply lines and black market deals that kept the base running smoothly. He traded gasoline for information, medical supplies for silence. It was a lucrative, dangerous game, and in the fall of 1979, he had made a mistake. He had skimmed too much, promised a delivery to the wrong people, shadowy faction of East German intelligence operatives who did not appreciate being shortchanged. They wanted their payment, not in cash, but in kind. They wanted something. A US base could provide something that could be passed across the border without a trace. They wanted a man, an American soldier, a hostage, a bargaining chip, a ghost, to be disappeared into the Stasi prisons. Corbin was in a corner, refusing. Them would mean his own exposure, the end of his lucrative empire, and likely a very messy, very permanent end for him. He needed a scapegoat. A soldier whose disappearance wouldn't raise too many questions. A soldier who was already seen as a loner, an outcast. His eyes fell on the quiet, bookish private recovering in the infirmary. Private Daniel Sutton. The perfect lamb for the slaughter. The hidden witness was a man named Elias Bauer, a German national who worked on the US base as a mechanic. He was a ghost long before he witnessed a crime. A man who had perfected the art of being invisible. Elias was a product of the war's aftermath, born in the rubble of a bombed-out city, raised in an orphanage where hunger was a constant companion. His past was a void, his parentage a mystery. He had no history, no lineage, no one to claim. He had learned to survive by being quiet, by keeping his head down, by never drawing attention to himself. He was meticulously good at his job, his hands able to diagnose and heal the ailments of an engine with an intuitive grace. But with people, he was clumsy, silent. His eyes perpetually downcast. His secret was a profound, crippling fear of authority. The uniforms, the shouting, the casual arrogance of the American soldiers all triggered a deep-seated terror. A memory of other uniforms, other shouts, from a time he was too young to fully remember but which lived in his bones. He worked, he collected his pay, and he went home to his small, empty apartment, where he would sit for hours, listening to classical music on an old, crackling radio, the only beauty in his gray, featureless life. He had a hidden life, a secret solace. On the weekends, he would take his old Zundap motorcycle and ride for hours into the countryside, exploring the abandoned farmsteads and forgotten logging trails along the border. He was an amateur cartographer of forgotten places, a student of the landscapes, scars. He knew the woods around Sector 81 Delta better than any soldier. He knew the old hunting paths, the crumbling foundations of pre-war villages, and the location of a particular long-abandoned trench that was so overgrown it was almost invisible. It was his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of the past felt more real, more honest, than the loud, swaggering men he worked for. One rainy Saturday afternoon in October 1979, Elias was in his sanctuary. He was sketching the intricate patterns of moss on a fallen tree when he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle, a heavy, grinding sound that didn't belong here. He instinctively ducked behind a thicket of ferns, his heart pounding. It was A U.S. Army Jeep, its engine groaning as it navigated the rough, muddy track. It stopped not 50 yards from where he was hiding. 2 men got out. One was Sergeant Corbin, his face a mask of grim determination. The other was Private Sutton, his limp still pronounced, his face pale with confusion and fear. Elias recognized them both from the base. "What is this place, Sergeant?" Daniel's voice was thin, nervous, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the forest. "What are we doing here?" "Just a little errand, Sutton." Corbin's voice was a low growl, unnervingly calm, a little off-the-books task. "You're good at being quiet. I need quiet." Elias watched, frozen, as Corbin walked Daniel towards the edge of the hidden trench. He saw the confusion on Daniel's face turn to dawning horror as he realized where he was, as he understood the isolation, the finality of this place. He saw Corbin's hand move, a sudden, brutal shove that sent the younger man tumbling into the muddy ditch. From his hiding place, Elias could hear Daniel's cry of pain, followed by a desperate scramble. "Sergeant, what are you doing? What's going on?" Corbin stood on the edge of the trench, looking down, a predator gazing at its cornered prey. "You're a problem, Sutton, a loose end, and I'm a man who ties up loose ends." Blood ran cold. This wasn't an errand. This was an execution. He was a witness to something terrible. Something that would pull him into the very world of violence and authority he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. His every instinct screamed at him to run, to get on his motorcycle and disappear, to pretend he had seen nothing. But he was paralyzed, held captive by the unfolding horror. He was a ghost, watching a man about to be made into one. The fate of these 3 men, the poet, the predator, and the phantom, was now sealed in the cold, unforgiving mud of a place that didn't exist on any map. And the quiet mechanic, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was now the sole keeper of a secret that could get him killed. He lay there, hidden in the ferns, the smell of rain and fear in the air, his world fractured beyond repair. The rain started to fall harder, a cold, persistent drizzle that plastered Elias's thin hair to his scalp and blurred the edges of the scene before him. The world seemed to be weeping. In the trench, Daniel Sutton was struggling to his feet, mud sucking at his boots, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He held up his hands, a gesture of placation, of desperate negotiation. "Sergeant, please." His voice was a ragged plea, cracking with fear. "Whatever this is, we can work it out. I won't say anything. I swear to God, I won't say a word to anyone." Corbin let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. "That's the thing, Sutton. I know you won't." He slowly, deliberately, began to unbuckle the heavy leather belt from his waist. The metallic click of the buckle was unnaturally loud in the dripping silence of the forest. He wrapped the end of the belt around his fist, the heavy brass buckle gleaming dully in the gray light. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to scream, to shout, to create a diversion, anything to stop what was about to happen. But fear was a physical thing. A hand clamped over his mouth, a paralysis that spread through his limbs like ice. He was a spectator in a nightmare, his invisibility now a curse. "You were always a disappointment, Sutton," Corbin said, his voice conversational, almost bored, as he slid down the muddy embankment into the trench. He moved with a confident, fluid grace, a stark contrast to Daniel's clumsy terror. "A poet, a weakling. Crying in your letters home to your little girlfriend." Daniel's eyes widened. "You read my letters?" The question was a whisper of violation, a small personal horror in the face of a much larger one. "I read everything," Corbin said, stalking closer. "It's my job to know the weaknesses of my men. And you, son, are nothing but weaknesses all the way down." He swung the belt. The sound was sickening, a wet, percussive thud, as the brass buckle connected with Daniel's arm, the one he had thrown up to protect his face. Daniel cried out, a sharp, piercing sound of pain that was quickly swallowed by the forest. He stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, falling to one knee. Please, he sobbed, tears and rain mixing on his pale cheeks. Please, don't. From his hiding place, Elias could see the raw animal panic in Daniel's eyes. This was the brutal, lawless world he had tried to escape his whole life. The world of the bully and the victim, playing out in its most horrific form. He felt a phantom pain in his own bones, a memory of being small and helpless, of fists and pain and the futility of pleading. He was that boy again, hiding, watching, useless. Corbin was relentless. He was like a machine. The belt rose and fell, a steady, brutal rhythm of violence. He struck Daniel's shoulders, his back, his legs. Each blow was punctuated by Daniel's cries, which grew weaker, more ragged, devolving into gasping sobs of pain and terror. It wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. Corbin was taking a man apart, piece by piece, his face a mask of cold, focused concentration. This was his art form. This was his poetry. "You're nobody, Sutton," Corbin grunted, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his movements precise and economical. "You're a ghost, you were never even here." With each sentence, he punctuated the words with a blow. "No one will look for you, thwack, no one will miss you. Thwack, your daddy will probably be relieved." Thwack, that last one seemed to find a mark deeper than bone. A new sound tore from Daniel's throat, a sound of pure, undiluted rage. With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward, not attacking, but grappling, trying to get inside the arc of the belt. He crashed into Corbin, sending them both slipping and sliding in the slick mud. For a moment, a wild, impossible hope flared in Elias's chest. For a moment, the sheep was fighting back. But it was hopeless. Corbin was stronger, heavier, a master of this brutal calculus. He grunted in annoyance, more irritated than threatened. With a powerful heave, he threw Daniel off him. Daniel's head hit the hard-packed wall of the trench. With a sickening crack, he slumped to the ground, dazed, a thin trickle of blood beginning to snake from his hairline. Corbin stood over him, breathing heavily now, his eyes gleaming with a kind of ecstatic fury. He dropped the belt and drew a trench knife from a sheath on his boot. The blade was long and thin, a vicious-looking thing. Elias's mind screamed, "No, no, no, this was it. The point of no return." He had to do something, but what? Reveal himself? He would be next. Corbin would not leave a witness. His life, his small, quiet, invisible life, would be over. He would be just another body in the mud. And so he stayed, hidden, trembling, his cowardice a bitter acid in his throat. Daniel looked up, his eyes glassy, unfocused. He saw the knife. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was broken. But then, something shifted in his gaze. It was as if in that last moment, facing the absolute certainty of his own death, the fear fell away, replaced by a strange, quiet dignity. His eyes cleared. He looked past Corbin, past the knife, his gaze sweeping over the lip of the trench, over the dark, dripping trees. It was the look of a poet taking in one last, terrible landscape. His eyes met Elias's. For a single, heart-stopping second, their gazes locked. Daniel saw him. He saw the mechanic from the base, the quiet man, hiding in the ferns. And in his eyes, there was no accusation. There was no plea for help. There was only a profound, heartbreaking look of understanding. A look of shared sorrow. Of shared invisibility. A look that said, "I see you. I know you're there. Remember me." Then Corbin moved quick and final. He drove the knife into Daniel's side. Daniel's body arched, a silent scream frozen on his lips. Corbin pulled the blade free and struck again, and again. The methodical, brutal work of erasure. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. He couldn't watch any more. He pressed his face into the damp earth, the smell of wet leaves and his own terror filling his nostrils. He heard the gurgling, final breaths of Daniel Sutton. He heard the heavy, sucking sound of Corbin pulling his boots free from the mud. He heard the clink of metal as Corbin stripped the dog tags from Daniel's neck. He heard the rustle of clothing as he searched the pockets, likely removing any form of identification, and then, a new sound, the scrape of a shovel. Eliezer's heart hammered against his ribs. He dared to open his eyes, to peek through the ferns one last time. Corbin was at the edge of the trench, shoveling loose dirt and wet leaves over Daniel's body. He wasn't digging a grave, he was just covering him up, hiding him from view, letting the forest do the rest of the work. It was hasty, it was arrogant. He was so confident that no one would ever find this place, that no one would ever look for this boy. In his haste, a small object, dislodged from Daniel's pocket during the violent struggle, lay half buried in the mud near the body, unnoticed by the killer. It glinted, a flash of purple and bronze. The Purple Heart. Corbin, in his furious efficiency, had missed it. It was the one thing he had failed to erase. Elias watched until Corbin finished, until Daniel Sutton's body was just another lump in the floor of the trench. He watched as the sergeant climbed back into his jeep, his face impassive, as if he had just completed a routine piece of maintenance. The engine roared to life, and the jeep disappeared back down the track, leaving only the scent of exhaust and the deepening silence. Elias Bauer lay in the ferns for a long time, listening to the rain fall on the fresh grave of Daniel Sutton. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a haunted man. He was the keeper of a memory, the sole custodian of a murdered boy's last look. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. But now, it was mixed with something else. A terrible, crushing weight of guilt. He had done nothing. He had hidden while a good man, a poet, was slaughtered. He had been given a silent commission, remember beyond, he knew, with a certainty that felt like a death sentence, that this secret would be his life's defining burden. The injustice was no longer an abstract thing he observed from the safety of his invisibility, it was inside him now, a piece of shrapnel he would carry forever. The conflict was no longer external, it was a war within his own soul. A war between his instinct for survival and the ghost of Daniel Sutton, who would now walk with him for the rest of his days, in the years that followed. The memory of that day in the trench became Elias Bauer's silent, tormenting companion. He quit his job at the US base a few months later, giving a vague excuse about a sick relative. He couldn't stand the sight of the uniforms, the sound of American voices. He couldn't risk running into Sergeant Corbin in the mess hall, couldn't bear to see the man's impassive face and know the monster that lurked behind it. Every time he saw a jeep, his heart would seize. Every time it rained, he would smell the damp earth and the blood. The ghost of Daniel Sutton was relentless. Elias moved to a small town in the north, taking a job at a local garage. He tried to rebuild his quiet, invisible life. But the silence was different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. It was filled with the things he hadn't said, the scream he hadn't let out. The guilt was a cancer, eating him from the inside. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his sheets soaked with sweat. The image of Daniel's pleading eyes burned into his mind. Remember me. The words were a constant, silent refrain. He tried to confess, once. He went to the local police, his hands shaking, his story rehearsed. But as he stood before the bored-looking desk sergeant, the words died in his throat. How could he explain it? A German mechanic accusing a powerful American sergeant of a murder that had happened on a secret off-limits site. A murder of a soldier the US Army would surely deny ever existed. They would think he was mad. Or worse, they would make a phone call, and Sergeant Corbin, or men like him, would come to silence him permanently. The fear, cold and absolute, won out. He turned and walked away, the weight of his cowardice heavier than ever. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thomas Corbin's career flourished. The disappearance of Private Sutton was a minor administrative ripple. A deserter, the official report concluded. The kid was soft, unhappy, probably shacked up with some German girl, or made a run for it over the border. It was a neat, tidy explanation. No one looked too hard. No one asked too many questions. A poet from Texas was not important enough to disrupt the delicate balance of the Cold War. Corbin was promoted. His reputation as a fixer grew. He was transferred from Germany to more sensitive posts, places where his particular brand of ruthless efficiency was highly valued. Panama, the Philippines. The shadowy corners of the world, where the lines between right and wrong were blurred into non-existence. He left a trail of whispers and rumors in his wake, stories of men who crossed him and simply disappeared. But he was always protected, always insulated by the very system that deplored his methods but relied on his results. The cruelty that had once been a raw, instinctual thing was now honed, refined. He became bolder. He saw himself as an essential part of the machine, a necessary evil. He took what he wanted: money, power, the fear in other men's eyes. The memory of Daniel Sutton, if it existed at all, was a footnote, a piece of necessary business long since concluded. He was a man without a rearview mirror. The past was a country he never visited. He grew rich on the black market, his power extending far beyond the confines of the military. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, his throne built on the bones of men like Daniel Sutton. The injustice escalated from a single, brutal act into a systemic, ongoing crime. Corbin's impunity was a daily insult to Daniel's memory. While Elias was tormented by guilt in his greasy garage, Corbin was being decorated, celebrated, his monstrosity rewarded with promotions and prestige. He was a living monument to the idea that the powerful can write their own history, that the truth is whatever they say it is. For Daniel's family, the official story was a wound that never healed. The letter from the Department of the Army was cold, clinical. Daniel had deserted his post. He was a fugitive. His father's reaction was a quiet, volcanic rage. His son was not a coward. He was many things, but he was not that. The accusation was a final, unforgivable insult from a son who had done nothing but disappoint him. He tore up Daniel's books of poetry, burned his letters, trying to erase the memory of the boy who had brought such shame upon his name. But for Clara, the girl with the sky-blue eyes, the story of desertion was a lie she could feel in her soul. The Daniel she knew, the gentle boy who wrote her letters filled with such longing and beauty, would never have just disappeared. He would have written, he would have called, he would have found a way. His silence was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of the grave. She waited, for years, for a letter that never came, her hope slowly curdling into a quiet, lifelong grief. The betrayal she felt was not from Daniel, but from the world that had swallowed him whole and then blamed him for it. The escalating conflict was not one of fists and bullets, but of memory and silence. It was the growing, monstrous success of the killer against the deepening, silent agony of the witness and the unresolved grief of those left behind. The universe seemed to be rewarding the wicked and punishing the innocent. Each promotion Corbin received was another shovel of dirt on Daniel's grave. Each sleepless night Elias endured was another turn of the knife. Each tear Clara shed was another victory for the lie. The tension was not in a chase or a confrontation, but in the slow, grinding passage of time, which seemed only to entrench the injustice, to set it in stone, to make the possibility of truth more and more remote. The world had moved on, but for these three people, it was still a rainy Saturday in 1979, in a muddy trench, and a terrible secret was festering, waiting for a catalyst, a spark that could set the whole rotten structure ablaze. The tension was in the waiting. The universe was holding its breath. 46 years is a long time to keep a secret. For Elias Bauer, it was a lifetime. The ghost of Daniel Sutton had become a part of him, a constant, low hum of guilt beneath the surface of his quiet life. He was an old man now, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of turning wrenches, his face a roadmap of worry. He had never married, never had children. He couldn't bear the thought of tainting a family with the darkness he carried. His life was a penance. The plot twist, the catalyst, came not with a bang, but with a click. It was a Tuesday morning. Elias was sitting in his small, meticulously clean kitchen, sipping his weak tea and scrolling through the news on a second-hand tablet. His movements were slow, deliberate, the careful motions of a man who has long since made his peace with loneliness. He mostly read the local German news, but for some reason, that morning, he clicked on an international link. The headline was innocuous enough. Archaeological find on German-Czech border raises questions. Ilios's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. He clicked the link. The article was short, vague. An archaeologist, a Dr. Aris Thorn, had uncovered remains in a declassified military zone. The find was of potential historical interest, but it was the photograph that accompanied the article that made the air leave Ilias's lungs. It was a picture of a man's hand, caked in mud, holding a familiar hexagonal object, a purple heart. Elias stared, his vision tunneling. He could almost feel the cold rain on his skin, smell the wet earth. He zoomed in on the photo, his trembling fingers swiping across the screen. The engraving on the back of the medal was not visible, but he didn't need to see it. He knew what it said. He knew whose it was. After 46 years of silence, the mud had finally given up its dead. The past came rushing back. Not as a memory, but as a living, breathing thing. He saw Corbin's face, cold and cruel. He saw Daniel's eyes, that last heartbreaking look of understanding. Remember me. For nearly 5 decades, that memory had been his burden alone. But now, someone else knew, this Dr. Thorn. The secret was no longer his. It was out, a fragile thing in a world of lies. Elias knew what would happen next. He knew the denials, the cover-up. He had seen the face of that power firsthand. This archaeologist, this truth-seeker, would be crushed. The story would be buried again. This time under a mountain of official paperwork and classified documents, unless the ghost had another witness. For the first time in 46 years, the fear that had kept Elias silent was eclipsed by something else. A fierce, protective rage. They would not do it again. They would not erase that boy a second time. Not while he was still alive to speak for him. The guilt and the fear had been a prison. But maybe, just maybe, the truth could be a key. He spent the next 2 days in a frantic, obsessive state. He searched for everything he could find about Dr. Aris Thorn. He found his university profile, his published papers, his email address. He was a serious man, a respected academic, not a crank, not a treasure hunter. A man who, like Elias, seemed to care about the forgotten. But what could he offer? His word against a decorated officer. A hazy memory from nearly half a century ago. It was nothing. He needed proof, something concrete, something that Corbin couldn't deny. And then he remembered his motorcycle, his Zundap, his old, faithful companion. After he fled the border region all those years ago, he'd been paranoid. He was convinced they would come for him. He had stripped the bike down, planning to sell it for parts. As he was cleaning the canvas saddlebags, his fingers had brushed against something small and hard. Sewn into the lining. It was a tiny reel of recording tape in his youth. In his lonely explorations of the countryside, Elias had dabbled in recording the sounds of nature, birdsong, the whisper of wind through the pines. He had a small, concealable reel-to-reel recorder, a device he often carried in his pocket. On that fateful day, in his terror, he had forgotten it was there. He had forgotten that as he lay in the ferns, a witness to a murder, the machine had been running, silently, faithfully, capturing it all. He had found the tape a month after the murder. The shock and fear had been so great that he had done the only thing he could think of to protect himself. He had hidden it. He had taken the tiny reel, sealed it in a small tin box filled with grease to protect it from moisture, and buried it in the dirt floor of his cellar. An act of self-preservation, an act of profound cowardice. He had buried the truth along with Daniel Sutton. Now, decades later, he tore apart his cellar like a madman. His old body fueled by a desperate, newfound purpose. He overturned dusty boxes, broke apart rotting shelves, until his shovel hit the small rusted tin. His hands shook so violently he could barely open it. But inside, preserved in its cocoon of grease, was the tape. A tiny, fragile ribbon of magnetic dust, a ribbon that held the voice of a killer and the last pleas of his victim. Finding a machine to play it on was another challenge. It took him a week, a series of visits to antique shops and specialty electronic stores, until he found an old hobbyist who could rig a player for him. As he sat in the cluttered workshop, the old man threading the delicate tape onto the machine, Elias felt as if his entire life had led to this moment. The old man flipped a switch, a low hiss filled the room, and then a voice. A young man's voice, thin with fear. "Sergeant, please. Whatever this is, we can work it out." Elias closed his eyes, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. It was real. It was all real. He listened, transfixed, as the entire horrific scene played out. Once more, not in his memory, but in the air around him, Corbin's cold, taunting voice. The sickening thud of the belt buckle, Daniel's cries, the final gurgling sounds. And, captured faintly in the background, the sound of the rain, the dripping of the trees. And the terrified, ragged breathing of a hidden witness, his own. The full conspiracy, the full calculated evil of it, was laid bare. Corbin hadn't just killed a man. He had staged a meticulous psychological demolition. He had used Daniel's personal history, his deepest insecurities, as a weapon. He had read his mail, learned his secrets, and used them to torture him in his final moments. The tape was not just evidence of a murder. It was a recording of a soul, being systematically destroyed before the body was disposed of. It was proof of a crime so personal, so sadistic, that it transcended a simple killing. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about justice for one forgotten soldier. This was about exposing a monster who had been allowed to thrive in the shadows of power for nearly 50 years. A monster who was, as Elias quickly discovered through more frantic online searching, now a highly respected, retired colonel. Colonel Thomas Corbin, a man who consulted for private military contractors, who sat on boards, who gave speeches about duty and honor. A pillar of the military establishment. Elias knew what he had to do. He had the weapon, the diary, the confession. The irrefutable proof was this fragile piece of tape. He copied the audio to a digital file, his hands fumbling on the unfamiliar computer. He composed an email, his words stark, simple, his English clumsy but clear. To Dr. Aris Thorne, "You found the medal. I know who it belongs to. I was there. I saw it happen. I have proof. They will try to stop you. They will try to silence you. Do not let them. The man who did this is Colonel Thomas Corbin. The tape is the truth." For Daniel Sutton, a witness. He attached the audio file. His finger hovered over the send button. This was it, the moment of truth. The end of his life of hiding. By sending this, he was stepping out of the shadows and painting a target on his back. Corbin was a powerful man. He would not hesitate to eliminate a threat, even an old, frail one. But then, he saw Daniel's eyes again. "Remember me," he pressed send. The tension, once a slow-burning internal conflict, was now a live wire sparking across the globe. An archaeologist in a muddy trench, a haunted mechanic in a dusty German town, and a powerful colonel in his pristine Virginia mansion were now on a collision course. The plot twist wasn't just the discovery of the tape, it was the reawakening of a conscience. The hidden clue had surfaced, and with it, the hidden witness had finally found his voice. The private pain of 3 individuals was about to become a very public scandal, and the fuse had just been lit. The quiet hum of the universe waiting had become a screaming crescendo. The email landed in Aris Thorne's inbox like a grenade. He was in a small, cheap hotel room in a town near the dig site, living in a state of paranoid limbo. Just as Elias had predicted, the official hammer had come down, and it had come down hard. His university had suspended him, pending an investigation. His colleagues had stopped returning his calls. The U.S. Embassy had sent a terse, threatening letter, warning him of the legal ramifications of possessing and disseminating classified state information. Even though he knew the only classified information was a murder. He was isolated, discredited, and scared. He was beginning to doubt himself, to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. If the pressure had finally made him crack. Then he saw the email. A witness. He opened it, his heart pounding. He saw the attached audio file. He clicked play. He listened for the full 7 minutes, his blood turning to ice. He heard it all. The voices, the rain, the blows, the final terrible silence. It was the raw, unedited sound of evil. All his archaeological evidence, the bones, the metal, the fractures, was now given a voice, a narrative, a soul. He was no longer just a scientist with a controversial theory. He was the custodian of a victim's last moments. The cinematic payoff could not be a quiet affair. A secret this dark, protected for so long by a system so powerful, could not be undone with a quiet report or a backroom deal. It needed to be a detonation. It needed to be public, explosive, and undeniable. Justice, Aris realized, needed an audience. He knew he couldn't go through official channels. The system was designed to protect men like Corbin. He needed a different kind of weapon. He needed a storyteller. He reached out to one person he knew he could trust. A former student of his who had left academia for the more volatile world of investigative journalism. Her name was Lena Petrova, a fierce, relentless reporter with a reputation for breaking stories that powerful people wanted to keep buried. Lena listened to the tape, her face hardening with each passing second. When it was over, she didn't speak. For a full minute, she just stared at the audio waveform on her laptop screen, as if it were a living serpent. "My God," she whispered. "They let this man become a hero. They formulated a plan, a three-pronged attack designed for maximum impact in the modern media age. It was a plan for a public execution of a reputation, to be followed by a literal one." Phase 1 was the hook. Lena, using her considerable skills, found a photograph of a young Daniel Sutton. It was from a Texas newspaper archive, a photo of him winning a local poetry contest, his smile shy and hopeful, his eyes full of dreams. She paired it with a recent photograph of Colonel Thomas Corbin, taken at a lavish veterans gala, his chest glittering with medals, his face smug and self-satisfied. She posted them side by side on her verified social media feed with a simple, chilling caption. One of these men was a poet. The other was his sergeant. In 1979, the poet disappeared. This is the story of why the post was a spark in a dry forest. It was shared thousands of times within the hour. The contrast between the two faces, the gentle dreamer and the decorated predator, was irresistible, a perfect, viral morality play. Phase 2 was the evidence. While the social media firestorm was building, Aris and Lena gave the story, exclusively, to a major international news organization with a reputation for rigorous, long-form investigative journalism. They gave them everything. Aris's photos of the site, his meticulous archaeological report, the official denials from the embassy, the story of the pressure campaign against him, and, of course, the tape. The news organization spent a week verifying everything. Audio experts authenticated the tape, confirming it was unedited and consistent with the technology of the era. Military historians confirmed the unlikeliness of a soldier being in that sector, corroborating the cover-up. Reporters in Texas found Clara, now a grandmother, with sad, sky-blue eyes, who wept as she listened to the boy she loved's final letters. Her lifelong grief finally given a name and a face. And Lena found Elias. She flew to Germany and met the old mechanic in his small, clean apartment. He was terrified, but resolute. He told his story on camera, his voice shaking but his eyes clear. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man demanding that a debt be paid. His quiet dignity, his profound lifelong guilt, was devastatingly powerful. The story broke on a Sunday night, a massive multi-platform feature. It was the lead story on the nightly news, the front page of the website, a full-length documentary feature. It was titled simply, "The Poet and the Sergeant." The centerpiece of the report was the tape. They played excerpts of it on the broadcaster. Please, the taunts, the blows. They bleeped the profanity, but they couldn't bleep the horror. The raw, brutal sound of the murder cut through the noise of the modern world. A ghost crying out from a forgotten grave. The public reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. It was a global howl of outrage. Hashtag Justice for Daniel Sutton trended #1 worldwide. The story had everything: a murdered young poet, a sadistic villain hiding in plain sight, a secret witness, a decades-long cover-up, and the irrefutable, damning sound of the crime itself. It was a scandal that broke the internet, a courtroom bombshell delivered to every phone and television on the planet. Colonel Thomas Corbin was besieged. Reporters camped outside his sprawling Virginia home. His phone rang incessantly. His powerful friends, the ones who had protected him for years, suddenly went silent, scattering like cockroaches in the light. The institution he had served, the one he had used as a shield, turned on him. The pressure was immense. The Pentagon, facing a public relations nightmare of historic proportions, immediately announced a full-scale investigation. This brought them to Phase 3, the confrontation. Corbin had agreed to a single television interview. A desperate attempt at damage control. He chose a famously combative cable news host, hoping to use the aggressive format to paint himself as the victim of a media witch hunt. He sat in the studio, defiant, his face a mask of indignation, his chest bare of medals for the first time. In his public life, he denied everything. The tape was a fabrication. Thorne was a disgraced academic. Bauer was a delusional old man. Sutton was a deserter who probably met a bad end with his criminal contacts. He was a war hero, being slandered by the unpatriotic left. He was arrogant, dismissive, and utterly convincing to those who wanted to believe him. But Lena and Aris had planned for this. They had held one thing back. Halfway through the interview, the host paused, a grim look on his face. "Colonel, we have a guest who would like to join the conversation." The studio doors opened, and Elias Bauer walked out, flanked by Eris Thorne. Corbin froze. His mask of arrogant composure shattered. For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic appeared in his eyes. He had not seen that face in 46 years, but he recognized it instantly. The quiet mechanic, the ghost from the forest. Elias walked, slowly, deliberately, to the interview table and sat down directly opposite Corbin. He did not look at the host. He looked only at the man who had haunted his dreams for a lifetime. "Do you remember me?" Elias asked, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of decades. Corbin blustered, trying to regain control. "I've never seen this man in my life. This is a disgrace, an ambush." "You saw me," Elias said, his voice unwavering. "You saw me in the trees, the day you killed that boy. The boy you called a disappointment." Then Aris spoke, his voice cold and precise. "Colonel, you said you search all your soldiers, that you know their weaknesses. You read Daniel Sutton's letters. Did you ever read his poetry?" Before Corbin could answer, Aris slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of Daniel's last poem, found in his locker after he deserted. A poem he had written for Clara Dot. The host picked it up and read it aloud on national television. It was a beautiful, heartbreaking piece about the color of the sky, the memory of a laugh, and the fear of being forgotten. A poem about love and hope from a boy on the edge of darkness. As the host's voice filled the studio, they cut to a split screen. On one side, a photo of the young, hopeful Daniel. On the other, the face of Colonel Thomas Corbin, crumbling in real time. The juxtaposition was devastating. The poet and the murderer, the victim and the villain, finally facing each other across the years. But the final cinematic blow came from Elias. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Corbin's. "He had a gold tooth," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was picked up by the microphone, a whisper heard around the world. On the upper left side, a gold cap on his molar. "Is that in the official report, Colonel? Or is that the kind of detail only a man who is there would know?" That was it. The detail that had never been released. The detail Aris had held back. The tiny, gleaming piece of truth from inside a dead man's mouth. Corbin stared, his mouth opening and closing. No sound coming out. In his eyes, you could see the whole rotten structure of his life collapsing. The lie was dead. There was nowhere left to hide. He was no longer a decorated colonel. He was just a murderer in a nice suit, exposed, humiliated, and utterly destroyed. On live television, the interview ended. As Corbin was hustled out of the studio by his frantic lawyers, federal agents were waiting for him in the hallway. The arrest was quiet, almost anticlimactic. The real sentence had already been delivered. The public had been the judge and the jury. The cinematic payoff was complete, not just an arrest, but a full-scale, soul-flaying exposure. The ghost of Daniel Sutton had finally been heard, and his voice had torn down a monster. The emotional aftermath was not a celebration. It was a quiet, somber reckoning. The rage of the scandal faded, leaving behind the hollow ache of a grief finally acknowledged. The world moved on to the next headline, the next outrage. But for those at the heart of the story, the echoes lingered. Colonel Thomas Corbin's trial was swift. The evidence, the tape, Ilias's testimony, Arisa's forensic findings was overwhelming. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in a Supermax facility 6 months later, from a heart attack in his cell, a quiet, ignominious end for a man whose life had been so loud and violent. There was no poetry in his death, just a biological fact. Eris Thorne's career was reinstated, his name cleared. He was offered prestigious positions at major universities, hailed as a hero of historical integrity. But he turned them all down. He had lost his taste for the quiet, dusty world of academia. The ghosts he had unearthed were too real, the injustice too visceral. He used the money from book deals and interview rights to establish the Sutton Project, a foundation dedicated to using forensic archaeology to investigate cold cases, specifically those involving missing soldiers and political disappearances. His work was no longer about the past. It was about giving the past its due, about forcing the present to answer for its crimes. He spent the rest of his life in muddy trenches and sterile labs, searching for other Daniels, other forgotten souls, waiting for their story to be told. He had found his calling, but it had cost him his peace. Elias Bauer returned to his small German town. He was a local celebrity for a time, a reluctant hero. But he shunned the attention, retreating back into his quiet life. The difference was that the silence was no longer a prison. The ghost was at rest. He had fulfilled his silent promise. He had remembered. He lived out his remaining years in a measure of peace, tending to his small garden, listening to his classical music. When he died, his will requested that he be cremated and his ashes scattered in the forest near Sector 81 Delta, the place of his greatest terror and his ultimate redemption. He wanted to be with the spirits of the woods, a silent guardian in the place where he had finally found his voice by speaking for another. The most poignant piece of the aftermath belonged to Clara. Now, in her late 60s, she flew from Texas to Germany for the reinterment ceremony. Daniel Sutton was finally being laid to rest, with full military honors at a U.S. cemetery. His name cleared, his status changed from deserter to killed in the line of duty. The old, dismissive father was long dead, but Clara was there, representing the love that had been the anchor of Daniel's short life. She stood before the new, pristine white headstone. It read, Daniel Sutton PVT, U.S. Army Texas Sept 1219540 CT, 271979 Purple Heart. A poet and a SO.LD Orris stood with her, a respectful distance away. He watched as she reached into her purse and pulled out a small worn book of poetry. It was a collection by Rilke, Daniel's favorite, the one he had quoted in his last letter to her. She didn't read from it. She simply placed it at the base of the headstone, a final belated gift. He was afraid of being forgotten. She said to Eris, her voice soft, her sky-blue eyes filled not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a deep, melancholic peace. He wrote that to me once. His biggest fear was just disappearing, becoming a blank space where a person used to be. She looked at the grave, at the name carved in stone, a name the world now knew. You brought him back, she said, turning to Eris. Thank you. There was no grand reunion, No cathartic breakdown. It was just a quiet moment of healing, a closing of a circle that had been left open for nearly half a century. The cost of the truth had been immense. It had consumed lives, haunted dreams, and revealed a darkness that could never be fully expunged. But in the end, it had accomplished something small and profoundly important. It had filled a blank space. It had turned a forgotten ghost back into a man. Aris left Clara at the graveside and walked back toward the cemetery gates. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neat rows of white crosses. He thought about the metal, the glint of metal in the mud that had started it all. He thought about the gold tooth, the tiny detail that had unraveled the universe. Of lies, the truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it waits, patiently, under the cold, silent earth, for someone willing to listen. The emotional echo of Daniel Sutton's life and death would linger. A haunting reminder that every ghost has a name, and every silence has a story. And some stories, no matter how long they are buried, demand to be told. The world was full of trenches, and Aris knew, with a certainty that was both a burden and a blessing, that his work was far from over.